You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Dr. Amy Harrison. In this season of Research for the Real World, we're talking about language, culture, and the arts in education, and the impact research in these areas can have on everyday lives. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Evangelos Himonides. Evangelos is a professor and chair in technology, education, and music. He is Fellow of the RSA and Chartered Fellow with the British Computer Society. Beyond academia, Evangelos wears many hats: musician, technologist, educator, and sound engineer. I'm very excited to hear your insights and discuss your fascinating work today. So welcome to the podcast, Evangelos.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's brilliant to have you on. We've got lots of interesting research to discuss today. And I wanted to start by reflecting on the sort of idea that your work really uniquely bridges technology, education, and music. What led you to this intersection, and how has your research evolved over the years to address these interconnected areas?
Well, that's both a very simple but also a very complicated question to answer. The simplest answer would be that I've always been very passionate about all three, and at some point I realized that what I wanted to do didn't exist as a kind of formal focus. So I followed the old proverb that suggests that whenever you cannot find what you're looking for, you create it. But just to be a little bit more serious, I come from a family of educators. I mean, for as long as I can trace my family roots, everyone has been a teacher, an educator of some kind. Technology has always been a very big part of who I am and what I have been doing. I grew up in a family, again, my father being a professor of computer science and information technologist. From a very young age, playing with computers and automata and any other kind of machine. And music has also been a part of the extended family, but has also been my escape from formalism and from the set sciences. So my formal involvement with music actually didn't start from a very, very young age, although I did take some lessons when I was pupil. I started formally and with an intense focus on music in my 20s. So technology has been a positive catalyst in me developing as a musician, but music has also been vice versa, an opportunity for me to question my technological self and also my educator self. So all three have been working in synergy, and it's just a pleasure and a very great privilege for me to be able to claim that I work on the intersection of those. It's a very special honor for me, and it's also very special for me to be located at the Institute of Education, which is one of the few loci in the world locations where you can actually explore intersections like that with the freedom to do so. When in other places, you really need to be put in a box and you need to be doing something very, very specific in order to satisfy the people above you.
A lot of the developments that you've come across, have happened because you weren't working in a silo, and you've brought together these different areas. And what a fascinating history. It sounds like it's very embedded in your family history. And, I also heard it's never too late to start practicing music. So that's lovely to hear. And your research emphasizes the link between music, health, and well-being. Can you share a key finding or maybe a moment in your work that highlights music's transformative power in these areas?
Well, I could share a finding, or I could share a couple of thousands of findings, given that one of the things that we're going to be discussing is focused on work that I've done in curating those. But for me, the biggest finding of it all boils down to the fact that as my former doctoral supervisor and now colleague and friend Graham Welch has been writing, we are all musical, and it's something that is part of us as humans, to the extent where, I mean, it's not my type of research to argue or debate whether that is the case or not, but at least be able to highlight that to some scholars out there, music even precedes language. So there are scholars and colleagues out there whose research suggests that language is actually an artifact of the musical humanity. So many times you will find me debating about whether it is actually the appropriate focus to look at whether music causes or results particular things, or whether it has certain benefits, and arguing that in most cases the appropriate discussion would be to look at the lived experiences, look at the importance, and look at the fact that there hasn't been any culture or any group of people, any form of organized society that didn't have some kind of musical activity embedded in everyday praxis. So a discussion about whether we have benefits or not from engaging with music is a completely myopic, or misfocused at least, exploration, and that music is part of who we are, and we wouldn't be what we are if we didn't have music.
That's very profound. Evangelos, in 2022, you co-authored a book called The Power of Music, an exploration of the evidence. And this has garnered significant attention worldwide. Can you tell us a bit about what the motivation was for writing this book? And how do you think its widespread reception has influenced the public's understanding of music and its impact on society?
Absolutely, I can, but it would be important to clarify that this was the brainchild of another colleague of ours and a very important person at the Institute of Education and former dean in the Faculty of Psychology and Human Development, Professor Susan Hallam, who is now Professor Emerita. So the book that we wrote is essentially an augmentation of the scope of the initial book that she wrote, which was also called The Power of Music. But that initial publication, which was a result of a small-scale funded research that was funded by the Music Education Council in the UK, was mainly focused on early childhood. And that had amazing reception. That was an initial attempt to curate and explore evidence in the power of music. And it had been, because of that positive reception and because of the influence on policy and thinking, and because of its contribution to shaping thinking about the role of music within the educational context, but also through the whole lifespan and how important it is, it was not lost on Sue that something greater had to be done by augmenting its original scope. And at that point, Sue rehearsed with me the possibility of working together in producing this. And of course, I immediately latched onto the opportunity because it has been the greatest honor of my professional academic life to have my name next to Sue Hallam's for working on something like this. But we wanted to also make it very clear that we were exploring the evidence. And we wanted to make that clear because part of the criticism that we offer in that book is the fact that one has to be very, very precise and very clear about what the intentions of any kind of assessment or exploration or exploratory or scoping exercise is. And in many cases, one of the things that we wanted to present within this book is how completely ill-informed or at least confused some studies or some people in the past had been in trying to gather evidence, either in an inappropriate way or to solely gather evidence about the role of music that had only been researched in a very specific way. And that was a big problem because in most cases you will see that some of the studies that sprouted in the past years that were actually arguing that music doesn't really play a major role in life were misinformed enough to cherry pick only very, very specific methodological approaches in selecting what kind of studies they wanted to meta-analyze or perform meta-analyses of in order to see whether music makes a difference or not. And both Sue and myself had been very passionate about how inappropriate that kind of ill-selective ethos is. And I mean, to the extent that I have been quite colorful in the past, trying to demonstrate to either younger students or less scientific audiences about the fact that an equivalent to that kind of approach would be to look at the efficacy, for example, of the COVID vaccine by only including studies that employ self-reflexive autoethnographic kind of research in order to research the efficacy of a vaccine. So the central point of what we wanted to explain is that we always need to be very sensitive to what is the actual effective or usual or normal or expected way to research something within a field. And we cannot just cherry pick something because it is seen by certain funding groups or certain policymakers as the golden standard of performing research, for example, that being the randomized controlled trials. So
Yeah,
this is how things were sprouted. I'm sorry for the kind of long-winded response.
it's fascinating. It sounds, you've really challenged and pushed back in your career. And another thing that really impresses me about your work is that you've really been able to cross academic boundaries and you've engaged a lot with the wider public. You've taken your research beyond academia, for example, with appearances on The One Show and The Unexplained with William Shatner, and through collaborations as well with artists like Vanessa May and Pulp. How do you think these public-facing projects contribute to the wider impact of your research? And what lessons do you have to share about engaging with these diverse audiences?
Oh, that's a very big question. And also multifaceted one. Some of the things that I have done in the past, I had the privilege and the fortune of doing wearing my technological hat, I have to admit. So in some cases, I had the luxury of becoming involved with different research projects, mainly because specific technical expertise were needed either for the methodological design or the experimental design or for the analytical parts of a project. The work with Vanessa May, for example, and Jarvis Cocker and Richard Hawley, these were all part of a series of documentaries. The one with Jarvis Cocker and Richard Hawley were part of an American documentary funded from the National Broadcast Radio, National Public Radio, NPR, I think. Yes, NPR, which was part of a series called The Musical Instinct. And that was a very heavily funded and very high budget project that ended up being presented by Bobby McFerrin, and it had international heavyweights involved like Daniel Levitin and other colleagues. For that, I collaborated with a brilliant neuroscientist, Professor Larry Parsons, who was then at Sheffield University. And that was part of work that we did in trying to do neuroscientific research and essentially look at what lights up in the brain when different types of musical activity occur. And finally, that led to a piece of research that was the first of its kind ever conducted that had to do with the voice as an agent of evoking emotional response. And the initial research that I did with Larry was trying to solve technical issues about how do you actually have people singing together when lying in two different brain scanners in a hospital. So
Oh,
I
that
was
must
there
be
to
very
solve.
difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I was
difficult
there
problem.
to solve the technical issues of actually enabling people to hear themselves within a brain scanner, an MRI scanner, but also to hear stimuli, to hear each other, to hear instructions from the researchers. It was a highly complicated and kind of Daedalus project.
Yeah, those machines are so noisy and so they make really
Absolutely.
strange sounds, don't they? So that's really
Yeah.
interesting to imagine people singing together in them.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, as you can imagine, these projects are so complicated and they're so multifaceted that for a long time, parts of what is being published or what is being kind of emphasized doesn't sometimes have to do with the core questions that you're trying to answer, in many times they have to do with the whole experimental design. So we've done a couple of publications about this work that was solely focused on the logistics of this and how you actually set up an experiment like that. But preliminary data that we had from that were confirming what, I mean, in most cases we've always known, which was that actually singing together with another human being is not just any other form of musicking, and that singing together with another human being essentially activates centers in the brain that are different to any other form of musicking with another person. So conditions where you have musicking on your own or musicking but not singing with someone else, and then another condition which is singing with someone else, rendered kind of different levels of activation, with the third one being the one that has the greatest level of activity, but also overlap with centers that are known to be activating with social activity, but also empathy. So, I mean, this has always been a great passion of mine, and the voice and singing in particular, and that's what I actually did my PhD on, which was singing focused. Other work that we have done, the thing that you mentioned about Vanessa May, for example, was also conducted in Sheffield at the Royal Hallam Hospital there, because they do have dual MRI scanners. And that was part of a BBC series that was focused on nature versus nurture, which is one of the very, very big debates that have been torturing the intellectual humanity for
It's a very
for
fundamental
centuries.
question.
Yeah, do we make people, or are they born? And it's also something that really fascinates me, especially when it intersects with music. Well, since a lot of research has happened, and that includes fascinating research by people that have been doing twin studies, where you actually have the opportunity to filter out the nature part because you're comparing identical human beings that have identical DNA. So you can then infer about the environmental factors. So that was what we did with Vanessa May, and that particular focus for that was obviously becoming a kind of a musical prodigy, and even more specifically, the focus for that work was the possession of perfect pitch, which is something that many researchers have been trying to understand for centuries. Going into that, you then have the intersection with work that I've done within special needs. And that very nicely dovetails to the discussion about perfect pitch, because another thing that you will realize when you engage in research that is relating to music and special needs and savants, and also contexts where something was in existence but was lost because of trauma or because of a stroke or because of aging or dementia, you will see that within or under the umbrella of special needs, you will find a disproportionate number of people that are absolute pitch possessors. So you will see that, for example, blind musicians or musicians that are autistic but also musical, in most cases, possess perfect pitch. That is celebrated by work that I have been very fortunate to be involved in, that was conducted by Professor Adam Ockelford at Roehampton University, with whom I worked extensively over the past 20 years in developing technology which we called Sounds of Intent, which is technology that I developed 20 years ago and led to the development of a portal that has served millions of people worldwide in trying to support children and young people with severe and profound and multiple learning difficulties with and through music, but also examples under that umbrella that have to do with musical prodigies and music savants like the famous Derek Paravicini, who is a blind pianist that has been featured in countless documentaries for the Discovery Channel, for BBC, for RTL, for RAI, where you're talking about a human being that might have the IQ of a 4-year-old, but has at the same time a repertoire of hundreds of thousands of different pieces and can play back a piece 300 milliseconds after they've heard it in any key.
Wow. Incredible. There's so many audiences that have benefited from your work, and you've just given several examples. And another example that I'm aware of is your work with Shout at Cancer. This is just a really powerful example of public engagement in action. You've been using music to aid speech recovery after people have had a surgical removal of their voice box, a laryngectomy. And you actually won the Queen's Award for Voluntary Services for it. And before that, this project won the UCL Provost's Public Engagement Experimentation Award. Congratulations. I mean, how did you design this project, and what do you think the impact of it has been on participants' lives?
Thank you, Amy. That project is a celebration of many things, actually. To begin with, it's a celebration of education not being a kind of box-ticking exercise where someone comes into an establishment, is fed information, and then leaves it with a degree. But it's also a celebration of the opportunities for the future in forging synergies between students and academics. And this is an example of this, because Shout at Cancer, the charity Shout at Cancer, was founded by a former student of mine, a medical professional, Dr. Thomas Moores, who at some point became aware that we were teaching about choral conducting, leadership and communication at postgraduate level here at the Institute of Education under the umbrella of our Masters in Music Education program. And Thomas took the choral conducting course as a standalone course. And from the very beginning, when I was introduced to his aspirations, I was shocked and I was excited about his ideas about what he wanted to do. And the main thing that he wanted to do was to actually form a charity that will support people that had lost their voices, as you correctly said, due to throat cancer and having undergone laryngectomy. The voice being a very big passion of mine and academic focus then allowed me to try and support Thomas and the charity in whatever way that I could. And that led to us bidding for smaller scale projects initially. One of those being a project that was funded by UCL Culture, and that was a beacon project for which the focus was to try to develop a public engagement project where we would employ novel vocal rehabilitation techniques using beatboxing as a creative outlet and a technique for rehabilitation, but also involving the public by having a public performance at the end of the series of workshops that we set up. That was amazingly successful, I have to say. This is what actually led to us receiving the award, the Provost Award for Public Engagement.
Yeah, I can see why you were awarded that. It's so innovative.
It ended up being very innovative, and it was also very rewarding in the sense that we punched way above our kind of pay scales in terms of actually producing way more than what the small funding that we received had prescribed. That led to a methods publication, a heavyweight publication on Frontiers about the techniques that were used and the protocols that were used in order to rehabilitate people. But it also led to a number of very exciting findings about vocal rehabilitation within those groups that had to do with our choice of platform, which was beatboxing. It being a very novel way in terms of its plurality, but also democratic kind of ethos to treat any kind of sound as a novel and exciting possibility. And that was very much appreciated by our laryngectomy group, because one of the problems with laryngectomy is obviously the sounds that people that have undergone laryngectomy produce are not necessarily received by non-knowledgeable kind of lay people as normal. So, which, if you think about it, is the bread and butter of beatboxing. Anything that is novel or not particularly normally sounding is something that is really sought after for beatboxing. It was a very rewarding thing to see, and it led to that final public performance that was very well attended and received amazing feedback. But it was also very interesting to see the excitement of the people themselves, of the laryngectomies, wanting to be part of this and wanting to perform and wanting to be part of a vocal group, even without possessing a voice.
That's amazing. You gave them their voice back and gave them a stage. Incredible. And Evangelos, earlier this year, Lord Bragg highlighted the need to value the arts more in the UK. What role do you think researchers should play in influencing public and political support for music and the arts more widely?
That's a very, very important discussion to have, Amy. And I mean, the concern that I would like to raise about this would be to try to have as holistic a discussion as possible and try not to be tyrannized or regulated by what one would expect to have to say or to do in order to tick the perceived boxes of what policymakers or funders would like to see. You will see that many times there is a lot of apology and a lot of submissiveness within the arts when we are talking about impact. And that is very unhelpful. Obviously, one has to play the game. Obviously, one has to comply and please, or at least tick funders and policymakers' boxes in order to be able to survive. But we need to remember that it is quite unhelpful to always look at the other than musical or other than artistic benefits in order to make a case for the importance of music and the arts. There is absolutely no need for that kind of apologetic stance. Music and the arts are important because they are important and because they are absolutely fundamental parts of our musical and artistic and general humanities. The other problem that I see is that even if one wanted to play this game, many times we are forgetting that music and the arts are actually a huge part of the UK's and global economy. We tend to forget that and try to focus on tangible kind of STEM outputs or industry or engineering outputs and products in inverted commas that have directly calculable kind of outcomes. And we forget the power and the role of music and the arts in the actual economy, especially for the UK. It is a major point of income and should be part of a discussion regardless of the other than musical benefits and how fulfilling it is for people's lives and how important it is for people's lives, but also how important it is for their development.
Absolutely. It's such an important message to think about the diverse ways that our work as researchers can impact lots of different stakeholder groups, lots of different end users. And I can hear that you're so passionate about this topic. And thank you so much. It's a really good tip for, I can imagine an early career researcher really being able to use that well in their work. I wanted to ask a little bit more about what you think is next for your research and your public engagement and impact work. Are there new challenges or opportunities in using music as a tool for education and social change?
Well, challenges are always going to be there. And the only thing that we can do is to keep going and to keep trying to stay as active parts of the discourse. I think that the past 10, 15 years have been very problematic in keeping the kind of ambient noise floor down. It's problematic because there is very little advocacy that you can do when you are trying very hard to stay alive. And statistics about course uptake, about policy support, about the role within an extended curriculum, the role of music and the arts, have been quite problematic. It has been a very challenging period, and I think that we need to place an emphasis in getting past any discussion about whether we should be looking at music and the arts as important subjects. They are absolutely fundamental, not just important. And we should be looking at developing greater research and more inclusive research and more nuanced research and methodologies and methodological approaches in order to gauge those most effectively. This is one of the additional reasons why we were very keen in working on this book with Sue, and myself was also very keen in ensuring that this work was publicly available for free.
Yeah, that really makes a difference.
So absolutely, because there is a lot of valuable research out there that is behind paywalls. Obviously, as academics, we do have, especially academics that are part of a global institution that is so highly ranked, we do have access to knowledge that other people don't have access to. But unfortunately, for the majority of the population, the only accessible thing is other people's claimed meta-analyses of the evidence base. And I have always been very passionate about trying to identify new ways in making research and digested research and meta-research essentially as openly accessible as possible.
Yeah, and the intersectionality of your work really, makes that possible. That's just so fascinating to think about the challenges that, you must have overcome across your career and these really innovative methods that you've developed and the collaborations as well that you've had, not only with academics, but with people with lived experience and, artists and musicians. It's just so amazing to hear about it. And I'm so grateful that I've had a chance to get to know you and hear a bit about your research.
I'm grateful for you
that.
giving me the opportunity to discuss that. As I said, it has been very rewarding. Sometimes it's very painful as well.
Yeah.
One cannot deny that.
It's not easy being an academic, is it?
Yeah, but it's particularly not easy being an academic that is schizophrenic enough to wear all of these different hats. Different people have different survival mechanisms. I tend to always play the opposite card. So I play humanitarian within the scientific circles and scientist within the humanitarian circles, if that makes sense. But I think that I also have the responsibility as someone who has some, at least rudimentary understanding of those conflicting worlds to try to educate people that things are not always the way that they think that they might be. So it is very difficult to explain to someone who has always been and only and solely been running randomized controlled trials that narrative inquiry does exist, that the celebration of lived experiences and looking in depth into lived experiences and looking into reflexivity and looking at testimonials and looking at real life stories is not something that is of value. It's something that is absolutely crucial and needs to be looked further, needs to be taken into account. At the same time, I'm also passionate within circles that solely look at the qualities, to understand that certain things can be biased, can be tinted, and do need to be supported by real data, by big data analytics, and by a new shift to our thinking from something that is hypothesis testing to just looking at massive data sets and try to see whether different correlations or different correlational systems might be identified that might inform us in a more effective way. So I'm both tyrannized but also privileged by my kind of multidisciplinarity to try and be more forgiving and more understanding and more flexible and not terribly aphoristic about how we assess certain things. And I think that it was a blessing to be involved and in that synergy with Sue Hallam, because she's a like-minded person. She's an amazing musician, but also an amazing scientist and psychologist and educator. And in this kind of like-minded way, we wanted to demonstrate that things are not as simple as some people have tried to present them.
Evangelos, you're a wonderful example for us all of a humanitarian scientist. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've really enjoyed having you. Thank you.
No, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've just heard from Professor Evangelos Himenides. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 23 past sessions. Search IOE podcast to find episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And a quick favour before you go, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Amy. Thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.